Russian President Vladimir Putin blames the Ukrainian president for the standoff, claiming it's a move to boost his ratings.
It's clearly a provocation organised by the authorities and, I think, the president himself, ahead of the presidential election scheduled to take place in Ukraine in March of next year.
International pressure against Russia is building, with talk of further sanctions. US President Donald Trump has threatened to cancel a meeting scheduled with President Putin at this week's G20 summit. Meanwhile, Ukrainians are preparing for a new phase of war, with the conflict showing no signs of stopping.
Let's go through this with Volker, who's a US Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations. He's also a former US Ambassador to NATO. Welcome to DW. Just explain to us what America's position in this latest outbreak of hostilities is.
Well, first off, that this is an act of aggression by Russia, that these were Ukrainian vessels traveling peacefully, seeking to go through the Kerch Straits to a Ukrainian port. They were not allowed to go through. They turned around, and as they turned around, and they were attacked and then boarded by Russians. And as we just saw in the report, Russia confiscated the ships and arrested the sailors. So both an illegal act to begin with, and then followed on by another illegal act of attacking this vessel. So
when Russia says that this was a Ukrainian act of provocation, the US response is?
Well, I'm not sure how this can be a provocation. A sovereign state has a navy. It's moving vessels from one of its ports to another one of its ports through its own waters. The problem here is that Russia has taken Crimea, has claimed to annex it, claims that the waters around Crimea are now Russian waters, and claims that despite a 2003 agreement with Ukraine, that Russia has unilateral control over access to the Sea of Azov, and then fired upon these vessels. I don't see anything that Ukraine did here that could be conceived of as provocative. It is, however, challenging Russia's assertions to having taken these Ukrainian pieces of territory and water.
And so the Russian game here is what? That this area of Ukraine of Crimea is ours?
Well, first off, that is the first thing. They say it is theirs. They're never giving it back. They've annexed it. They say it's done. But secondly, it's no matter what they do, and in this case, they've actually fired on Ukrainian naval vessels. There's no firing back by the Ukrainians, by the way. They've then abducted the people. They've confiscated the ships. And then they blame the Ukrainians for doing that.
So what's the United States going to do about it?
Well, I think the first thing is we're coordinating very closely with our European allies and partners. We have a robust policy of sanctions in place. We work with the Ukrainians on strengthening their defense capabilities, trying to strengthen resiliency in Ukraine. And our European allies are doing the same. There's talk, as we just saw in this report, about possible additional sanctions from Europe. We think that's worth considering. Alternatively, there are sanctions on the books that perhaps are not being implemented as rigorously as they could be. And that's something else that some of our European allies could look at.
You see, the world looks on and says, well, sanctions have already been applied, and Russia just keeps marching around that area, around Crimea, and saying, yeah, despite the sanctions, this is ours, and we'll have that as well.
And I think that misses a couple of things. First off, I think this could have been a lot worse. And I think the pressure that the West has put back against Russia for having invaded eastern Ukraine in particular and applying sanctions there has created some deterrent effect. Russia not wanting to escalate into a full-scale conflict, not seeking to take new territory. I think that the defensive support for Ukraine contributes to that as well. I also think that there's a lot of discussion in Moscow now, is this really working out for Russia? When you saw what happened a few weeks ago with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, for example, they're demanding independence from the Russian Orthodox Church precisely because the Ukrainian people are alienated because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and killing Ukrainians. So they've lost the goodwill of Ukrainian people, which had been there for centuries. So it's a major loss for Russia, really.
Do you see any role for a military response in this?
I don't see any desire by anybody to fight against Russia to retake this territory. The Ukrainians cannot and should not do that. There's no desire in the West to do that. But what we need to do is to deter further Russian advances as it being too costly and too useless for them in order to create the conditions for a negotiation to reestablish peace and restore the territory.
But do you realistically expect the territory to be reestablished? You talk about deterring Russia from further expansion. my reading of the situation is that once Russia has that bit of Ukraine, it'll be happy. This is what it wanted. It's got it now.
No, I don't think that's right. I think, particularly if you look at the Donbass, the part of eastern Ukraine where there is still active fighting every night, this is not territory that is terribly important to Russia as the territory in itself. It is because it provides a foothold into the rest of Ukraine. It provides a means of influence. The problem is that that influence has backfired. It has produced exactly the opposite of what Russia wanted. So there is an incentive for Russia to say, let's negotiate a peace agreement here. And what the Minsk agreements actually say is that the territory would be restored to Ukrainian control, and Russia is a party to those agreements. So it's a matter of finding the mechanisms. Can we get this implemented so that we can at least establish peace in that part? Crimea, it's going to be a longer-term problem, but in eastern Ukraine, I think there is some hope.
All right, good talking to you. Thank you for joining us. Kurt Volker, US Special Representative for Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you.